Welcome to this so-called Flight 2 follow-up video. Today we're playing with the JMB VL-3 in the vicinity of Fresno, California, as we try to better understand how controllers can respond to in-flight emergencies involving various engine failure scenarios. For the record, I'm filming this on October 15th of 2020, and what we're doing today is a little bit different than the other videos in this series. The main focus of this particular video is going to be an introduction to partial engine failures. Now, to my mind, I suppose most pilots would rather have a partial engine failure than a total engine failure, in that when you have a total engine failure, it's gone. You kind of have to play the cards you've been dealt at that point and so on. And you just got to deal with it, right? But at some level, it's almost easier that way because you've got some simplicity and you just have to deal with it. With a partial engine failure, there's actually a lot of decisions to be made. And for the purposes of this course, it's actually very tricky about how you sort of divvy up the responsibility for those decisions between the controller and the pilot, and we'll discuss some of that in this video. We're just going to kind of scratch the surface and present a couple of scenarios, but that's going to be the focus of this particular video. For the record, the standard caveats, including this is not real flight instruction. You're going to see some examples of that in this flight. I'm not flying this airplane the way I would in real life in a couple of different ways, and the opinions expressed in this video and throughout this course are my own. For the record, here are the flight sim settings. They're the same that I have been using recently, except this is the first video I've flown with version 1.9.5, which has some bug fixes that do not affect anything I've been doing recently. This is the same slide I have been using. You can partly ignore this one in that we're not quite going to fly 4 per flight. You'll see what I mean when we get to the video, but we're only going to actually fly a couple of these. And this will surprise you, but the takeoff scenario we're going to do is not technically going to be an engine failure, though it can be applied to a partial engine failure, some kind of rough running engine just after takeoff. In terms of how I'm flying these, I'm going to fly these generally to a variable private pilot level. I'm not going to use my full advanced bag of tricks. Occasionally I will deliberately fly poorly, including in the takeoff scenario as well as the final scenario. So both of the 2 flights I'm actually going to do, you'll see what I mean by that, but I will announce specifically what I'm doing poorly and for teaching purposes why. Occasionally in the video, I'm going to go back and forth between pilot mode, where I explain what a pilot may or may not be thinking or looking at, and controller mode, where I talk about what I think a controller should be doing at one point or another. So let's go fly, and I already have the plane lined up. We're on Fresno 11 left. Ballpark field elevation is roughly 330 feet. You can kind of see off to the left we've got the Sierra Nevada some distance away, but that's not going to affect us. So what we're going to do on this one, let me just describe it for you before we get rolling. This can be applied to a partial engine failure, but I'm going to actually set up a different scenario for this takeoff. Sometimes it happens that a pilot takes off, and then after takeoff, shortly after takeoff, they realize that they don't have the door latched, and so the door is flapping in the breeze, or it can be a baggage door. In this particular airplane, it would be maybe the canopy unlatched, which can be a serious problem. If it happens early enough on a long runway such as this one that the pilot could just land straight ahead, that's actually the relatively prudent thing. But for purposes of this video, I'm going to almost imagine that either the pilot catches it a little bit late for some reason, or it's in effect a shorter runway. And the pilot is going to take off. Shortly after takeoff, realize that maybe the canopy is unlocked and starting to move around a little bit. And I'm going to fly the airplane in a realistic way that, unfortunately, a lot of pilots operate the airplane in this situation, and I'm just going to be upfront with you. We are not going to make it back to the runway, and I will explain why. It will involve some deliberately poor stick and rudder skills, and because of the way the sim models the aerodynamics right now, I will be kind of exaggerating how poor that is. So I'm going to fly it more poorly than a real pilot would to show you what happens when a pilot flies this scenario somewhat poorly. So, volume coming up a little bit so you can hear the engine. We're going to get going. This particular airplane is very sensitive with the rudder, so if you try to take off and you're all over the place with the rudder, so be it. All right, we're off. Some pilots will pull the gear up virtually right away as soon as they establish a positive climb rate. Others would wait until they kind of deem that there's no way they're going to land on the runway remaining with the runway length and so on. I'll go ahead and pull the gear up here. I'm using a button on my yoke. And we're up at a speed where we're fast enough, north of 90 knots I can go flaps up. The white arc in this airplane I use to represent the limiting speed for the bottom 2 notches of flaps. I'm comfortable for simulator purposes using 1 notch of flaps at a higher speed. Okay, so we're climbing out, and maybe somewhere in here the pilot tells the tower, and probably doesn't declare a mayday or an emergency, but just, hey tower, this is November 123 Delta Bravo. I got a problem. I got a canopy that's unlasted. I need to come back. And tower says, okay, I've got no other traffic. You can go ahead and make left traffic. Cleared to land, runway 11 left. Pilot reads it back. Okay, most controllers at this point, as I'm starting to fly the airplane the way a lot of pilots would in this situation, unfortunately, I'm flying the airplane somewhat poorly already. There's a huge temptation when you've got a canopy unlocked or a baggage door that's flapping in the breeze, or like what happened to a friend of mine about 25 years ago, where the engine cowling is not totally secured and the engine cowling is flapping in the breeze. There's a big, huge temptation that the sim can't really quite model to fly the airplane about as slow as you possibly can, because with less speed, and this kind of makes sense, less flapping of the engine cowling, or less chance that something's going to happen to the canopy, right? And so what happens is pilots fly really, really slow. Now the controller in the tower, all right, this guy did not declare an emergency, but we've maybe stopped some other traffic. We kind of sense that there's a problem. We've cleared the guy to land, and we think, all right, our hands are clean, right? Well, what happens is, in this kind of situation, a lot of pilots, unfortunately, focus too much on the canopy or the door or the engine cowling, and they fly the airplane too slow, and it's still banging and beating on the airframe or something. And unfortunately, what happens, and I'll talk about a possible controller antidote to this, and now because of the aerodynamics, I need to purposely fly it super poorly. So I'm going to exaggerate. I'm going to help the turn with inside rudder, which is a big no-no. I'm going to fly it slow. I'm going to kind of mimic that I'm trying to keep the nose up to keep it slow as we're sort of turning back in. I have left the flaps up just because I want it to sort of stall here, but I'm going to bring the nose up and stall with inside rudder. And the sim doesn't model this super accurately, but I'm using this to mimic a stall spin accident. And crashes are turned off, so it's not going to end the flight there, as it were. But what happened is, unfortunately, this is what happens to real-world pilots when they concentrate on something else like this. Therefore, tower controllers, I am begging you, if you ever have a pilot present with something like this, with a door that's ajar or loose, or a canopy or an engine cowling or something like that, and they're coming back, by all means clear them to land. Please treat it as an emergency insofar as getting other traffic out of the way so this pilot doesn't have to spend extra time in the air. But then please, please, please exercise your voice of God powers and remind the pilot, do not stall the airplane. Do not stall the airplane. I argue that the pilot needs to hear that nice, calm voice of God coming through their headset, reminding them to not stall the airplane. Flight instructors cover this with student pilots in their pilot training. Pilots will hear it from time to time over the years as they continue to fly, but unfortunately, I think the statistics show that in the real world, when this happens, a lot of pilots in effect forget, and so all I'm begging you to do is just to remind the pilot about something that flight instructors already remind student pilots, so there's no controversy there. You're not distracting them from flying the airplane. You are helping them, and it's my argument that if we ever have a tower controller have an airplane present like this, and the tower controller reminds them, do not stall the aircraft, and the pilot makes it back to the runway safely, I argue, hands down, that that controller should be rewarded for saving the lives of everybody on board the airplane. I take that this seriously. All right, let me get off of that kind of soapbox for a second. I'm going to end this flight, and give me just a second to get this set up for the flight that we're going to do at the end, and then we're actually going to jump out of the simulator and kind of game out a couple of scenarios in a different way. So give me just a second to get this started. We're going to go back to KFAT. There. We're going to use 11 left, the same runway that we used a little bit ago, but I have to click on it and set as departure. There we go. Fly. I've got it muted, so I'm just going to let it load and it'll be ready when we come back to it later. All right, so let's switch gears now a little bit. And what I want to do is kind of go back and forth between a couple of things. So one is a couple of the charts for the area, as well as, and let me get it kind of queued up here, Google Maps with the satellite view. And let's talk about, first of all, setting up a scenario that I want us to kind of think about. So you'll notice in the vicinity of Fresno, as I zoom out, and it takes a second to load. Come on, internet. Why is it going this slow now? I had done a small dress rehearsal earlier and it loaded instantly. Oh well. Okay. So just north of Fresno Airport, you have this VOR up here called Friant or Friant. I'm not trying to mispronounce it and so on. And you can see there's some VFR or some Victor Airways up there. If I switch to the low chart, okay, among others, you can see Victor 459 up here. It crosses Friant and goes down to the southeast. Up here, the MEA is 8,500. Yes, there's a 6,600-foot MOCA that guarantees reception within 22 nautical miles. And then the MEA, if you were to go down Victor 459, is 5,700 feet down here. So let's imagine it's a nice VMC day that's calm winds, and you've got somebody on an IFR flight plan, and therefore Victor 459 southeastbound at 9,000, okay? So somebody's flying along. They just by chance happen to overfly the Mariposa Yosemite Airport. Okay, they're at 9,000 feet, and right about the time they come up on Kogel, and I'm just going to center the map by dragging it so that Kogel is right where the X is. And right about the time they get to Kogel, they suddenly, and I'm going to assume for discussion purposes that they're probably talking to Fresno approach. So they've already got, they're already talking, they've already got the local altimeter, and it's a nice VMC day. They're looking at the mountains off the left side. Somewhere right around Kogel, they tell Fresno approach, this is November 123 Delta Bravo declaring an emergency. I've got a rough running engine, or I've picked up a bad vibration. I'm not sure how long my engine's going to run. It could be an oil leak or something, okay? Request vectors to Fresno. Okay, now first of all, from Kogel, and we're just kind of eyeballing this, I'm not going to try to measure. You can see that Mariposa that they overflew is kind of a certain distance out here. I'm just eyeballing it. This Madeira Municipal is maybe just a tiny bit farther, but because they're southeastbound and it would take a 180, maybe Mariposa, definitely the higher field elevation by 2,000 feet is kind of up in the hills, and it's only 3,300 feet long, so I could see the controller might think, okay, Mariposa might not be a good idea between the 180 and the terrain and the shorter runway. Madeira might be a good option. It's a 5,500-foot runway. But that pilot asked for Fresno, and that can make sense too. I'm just eyeballing it. Madeira is a tick farther than Mariposa Yosemite. Fresno, or officially Fresno Yosemite, is a bit farther, but it's not that much farther. And that's what the pilot asked for, right? I want vectors to Fresno. Okay. And I'm going to assume for discussion purposes, and I'm just eyeballing this here, that the controller says, Number 123 Delta Bravo, roger. Cleared to Fresno Airport via flight heading 180 vectors for 1-1. Okay, or 1-1 left, which we're assuming is the active runway. Okay, that might strike you as reasonable. Now let me talk about something that a controller could do at that same point that is really, really bad, and in my mind, again, I have some sympathy with pilots who go slow because they've got the engine cowling flapping in the breeze, and thereby they do something that's ultimately pretty stupid, and they stall the airplane and they die. I think that a fair amount of controllers, I don't want to attach a number to it, do something in this situation when the airplane first presents up by Kogel that would be really, really stupid. And that is, and let's assume there's no traffic out there, we clear the airplane for a descent down to something like the MEA. MEA up here might be ballpark, 8,000 feet and then decrease as you get into the valley. But we clear them down or step them down as the MEA drops or something. I think that's stupid for controllers to do. And so one of the takeaways from this video is if a pilot presents, and we're talking about a kind of a cruise altitude type situation here, with a partial engine failure, I've argued that in a total engine failure, the very first thing a controller should do, generally speaking, it can be second, but it has to be super high priority, is remind the pilot to trim for best glide speed. Now, y'all are very smart, so guess what I'm about to suggest when a pilot has a partial engine failure. That's right. I recommend that we remind the pilot to trim for best glide speed. Now, aerodynamic purists might have a small argument about whether that's exactly the ideal speed for a variety of partial engine failure situations. You can make a case that best rate of climb speed, which is a few knots difference, is maybe marginally better, but essentially there's no difference. And even if I am aerodynamically very slightly wrong by recommending trimming for best glide speed, what happens is in any partial engine failure situation, we want to protect for the possibility it becomes a total engine failure. Well, that way we're ahead of the game, and even if I'm wrong about the exact optimum airspeed, we're only a couple knots difference, and it turns out it's very, very close. Now, depending on how much power the pilot still has, the pilot may or may not even climb. Think about that for a second. You know, if you've picked up a partial engine failure and you're still able to make something like half power, and that controller reminds you trim for best glide speed, that pilot might actually climb a little bit. Folks, altitude is a pilot's friend if and when that engine does fail totally. So if they climb and it's me working the airplane, I'm sitting back there going, woohoo, this is great. Yes, he's climbing. And the person next to me might be thinking, but Dean, he said he has an engine failure. And I'm thinking, yeah, great, he's got altitude, because when it hits totally, he's got more options, right? Okay, enough of that. So heading 180, trim for best glide speed. It's horrible if a controller descends the pilot in that scenario. If you want to, by all means, inform them of the MEA, give them a pilot's discretion descent, but please do not clear them down. Please do not think in a partial engine failure that you need to somehow. If they have to, they will, whether you clear them or not. Okay, now, here's one of the points I want to make from this. Let's talk about two things. So maybe we've said, trim for best glide speed. Maybe we've been a bad controller and started to clear them on down. Okay. And I'm assuming for discussion purposes that we're tempted to go to about a 180. By the way, I know there's some magnetic variation over here. You can kind of tell that the barb is not pointing true north. I'm just going to assume that we're talking in true north terms rather than magnetic here. So let's say we've assigned a heading of 180, more or less take them over the Clovis tack and I'm going to join some kind of 3-mile final. All right, two things to note. In the scenario, the way I set it up, the pilot expressly asked for Fresno or Fresno Yosemite, right? Okay, what kind of authority does the controller have? So the we've gone ahead and started the turn in compliance with what the pilot asked for. But just from ballpark here, and I'm going to kind of recenter the map, ballpark here, not exact. You can kind of eyeball it. Madeira is closer by a few miles than Fresno Yosemite. What role, if any, does the controller have in potentially steering the airplane over, the pilot over towards Madeira? That's a 5,500 foot runway. That's more than long enough, folks. That's plenty long, okay? So that's certainly a viable airport. Here's part of my case and where I'm going with this. A pilot, might, as they're flying along from, San Francisco or Sacramento down towards San Diego and taking this route, they might kind of loosely know that they're going past Fresno, but they're probably not looking at every single possible little airport along here as a potential off, route emergency landing site. And so it's quite reasonable a pilot might sort of have Fresno on the brain as they're coming up on the Fresno area and so on. And the pilot might not even have thought about that. And suddenly they get the vibration and they're up to eyeballs and they're, oh boy, I got all this stuff to do, and their thinking is busy. Okay. They might not even know about this or consider it. And so what I recommend that controllers do is, if you think there is something that is better for some reason, in this case Madeira instead of Fresno, okay, our job as controllers is to inform the pilot, but we want to be very careful about recommending, and we certainly can't command them, okay? So in this case, inform the pilot, okay? November 123 Delta Bravo, for your information, there's a closer airport off your right side, 2 o'clock, maybe, I'm just going to ballpark the mileage here, but 2 o'clock, 15 miles, it's a 5,500 foot runway, say intentions. Now, a pilot might choose, but at this point we've informed the pilot, and it's up to the pilot's choice to go ahead and divert to Madeira or press on towards Fresno. But there's something else I want controllers to think about. I'm using this low chart to kind of represent, in effect, what a radar map shows on our radar screens when we're working approach or center, something like that. One thing it doesn't show is some of the local terrain and built-up areas. So I'm going to leave the map where it is, and I'm going to switch. So I'm leaving that kind of X to represent where the plane is after the first minute or two. And I'm going to switch to a sectional. Okay, now we happen to be kind of northwest from O'Neill's here, and it looks like we're just past the tip of this Hensley Lake, right, just to get our bearings. Okay. What do you notice about these two options? It looks from a sectional chart like if the pilot elects to go towards Madeira and the engine fails at some point and they're not able to make it, to a first approximation, it looks like at least there's a chance that they have some kind of reasonable off-airport landing possibility that, even if it's still risky for anybody on the plane, at least does not risk people on the ground. You can kind of sense where I'm going because you all are very smart, right? What if we do the 180 true, as I'm just sort of eyeballing it, to something like a 3-mile final for 1-1 left into Fresno? What do you notice? The yellow represents essentially a built-up area. We're now adding risk to the pilot and anybody on board the airplane if the engine should fail and they're down low, but we're also adding risk to people on the ground. At this point, let me just kind of take a quick mental note here. We are northwest of O'Neill's. I'm ballparking, but roughly 300 true from O'Neill's, and we're just kind of off the tip of that excuse me, Hensley Lake. Let's go to this, to Google Maps. There's Hensley Lake. Was that the name of it? Doesn't matter, but where'd it go? Hensley Lake. Here's O'Neill, so we're somewhere up about here, just maybe south of Yosemite Lake. So I'm going to right-click and hit Measure Distance and just use that as our starting point. Now, and this is statute miles. I know we're using nautical in the ATC world, but we'll just kind of play pretend because I'm interested in the concept here. If you go straight to the runway threshold, we're talking about ballpark, just over 27 miles to get to the runway. But if we're doing something like a 180-ish true, for a 2 or 3 mile final, look what happens the last 8-ish miles in. If they lose the engine, especially as they're getting down low, we are now adding risk to the pilot, to the passengers, and to people on the ground, because if the engine fails that last 8 or so miles in, they really run out of options real quick. Yeah, there's a couple farm fields. I did zoom in earlier, and it's part of the agricultural test area for Cal State Fresno. So you can maybe get a little lucky here in Fresno where you might not in some other comparable cities or something. But by doing that, it's really bad. So there's a couple things we can do. One is try to leave them high, and that's another benefit. So the higher they are, the more room they have to maneuver. So if they're down low, down around the MEA, and they lose the engine, let's say somewhere about here, you're in an urban area, and that's just bad, okay? Whoops, I didn't mean to click that. If, however, the pilot stays high, and somewhere in here is still up kind of high, and then's like, all right, now I can, it doesn't matter if the engine quits, now I'm high enough and close enough I can glide the rest of the way in, then that underlying area is no longer all that relevant. Another option, and you can combine this with keeping the airplane high, and frankly I kind of prefer you would. So again, just kind of memorize 28.16 is what we're currently measuring approximately to the runway threshold. What happens if we vector them out to something more comparable to this? We only added ballpark 2.5 miles. It's not that much. And so even if, for purposes of discussion, let's assume that with calm winds, that today, for whatever reason, Fresno's using runways 1-1. I don't know which runway they prefer for calm wind operations. But even if 1-1's the active, in a partial engine failure, where the engine might fail completely, I argue that taking somebody in this scenario from that place, bringing them over the city to 1-1 is maybe a pretty bad idea if we instead go, and I'm ballparking this, but something like a 160, run them out to here, maybe like a 190, and then have them turn in, the last, 2 mile final or something. Here, even if they're somewhat lower, they're down low enough, they should be able to kind of bail off to the east side in this scenario. Now, every airport, every city is going to be somewhat different. And so one of the things I'd like to get at, and I'll get back to this at the end of the video, I actually would like local safety councils, and it doesn't have to be just safety councils, they can kind of get discussions started. But for the sake of discussion, and I don't know for the record anybody at Fresno, so I'm not picking on anybody there, but I could picture a Fresno local safety council trying to put together some kind of scenarios where, what if the airplane is up here in this kind of situation, and just actually have some discussions. And there's not necessarily a right or wrong, but kind of go through and forget the flight sim, just use Sky Vector with some of the charts like I've been using, and or Google Maps, and just kind of discuss and kind of game out, where would you send the airplane in this scenario? And it strikes me that from about here, I think, personally, it's much better to leave them here, although if you bring them in like this, you can kind of get away with it if you leave them high. If they start here and they're down low, I would kind of try to sell Madeira maybe a little bit harder, because now, down low, you got a long stretch over the city. If they start over here, there is no way I would bring them into 1-1, even if that's the runway in use. Get traffic stopped, bring them in on 2-9, okay? And kind of game out different places, different situations, where you would send somebody, okay? And I think that's useful for safety councils to do. So, again, this video is about scratching the surface and so on. But let's talk about another kind of scenario here. Another thing, and I'm just going to kind of park the starting point back up just south of where it labels Yosemite Lakes, okay? And for purposes of discussion, let's suppose that we are going to bring them like this, okay? By the way, to some extent, the controller, we don't have to run every single thing past the pilot, okay? Yes, the pilot's in charge, but the controller does have a role to exercise some reasonable judgment. And I know some of us would like to have things more black and white and would like to just pawn everything off on the pilot. But for some things, and again, this is where it's useful to sort of game things out in advance. For something like this, where we're only adding a couple of miles, go ahead and feel free to do this. But we can also do something else, and there's another benefit to gaming out different scenarios rather than just coming up with like hard and fast rules, and that is this. By gaming out different scenarios from time to time, we get practice, we get used to it, and especially for supervisors and CICs. So let's play another variation of this. Let's say we get this situation, and it's the controller right away who issues the 180 heading, trim for best glide speed, hopefully, rather than clear them down. Okay, but quickly get a supervisor or a CIC. And right now the engine's running. One thing I'd like at least, somebody else, be it supervisor or CIC, to do, okay, and it could be another controller who gets brought in, literally go over to maybe the supervisor's workstation if you can, literally bring up Google Maps, and you don't have to be exact on the location, but if you know the airplane's kind of over about in here for whatever reason, okay, and you kind of know that the plan at the moment seems to be we're going to run the guy out on a 160 heading before we bring him back for 2-9, you can literally use something like Google Maps, which does have limitations, and you can start to at least try to get ahead, and should the engine fail, have some better idea of where the airplane's going to go for search and rescue purposes, but also so you get some better sense of getting ahead on potential off-airport landing site recommendations, which I generally discourage. Okay, I do have a strong preference for non-urban areas compared to urban areas. I don't want to steer somebody towards an urban area, but also because I'm going to argue that if you find a rural divided highway, those are statistically fantastic places to go. So let's just kind of zoom in on Highway 180 here. As I zoom in, you notice it's a divided highway. Now you can debate just how rural this is, and this isn't the most rural place ever. This is almost like a suburban type thing. Close into town, if you were to kind of zoom in, let's say, and use the Google Street View guy and kind of park it on some random spot where we're imagining our pilot landing. I mean, these things have signs overhead. There's usually city levels type of traffic. There's another one back there. These tend to be not good landing spots. They might be better than other spots in that same urban area. But once you get out to something that's more away from the urban area, generally speaking, these spots, as I'm picking essentially a random location here, I have pre-scouted some of this stuff. Okay, these are good. Any power lines are almost always set back. Okay, there's very few billboards out here with exit signs. Traffic is moving at speeds comparable to aircraft landing speeds. You generally don't have power lines crossing the road. There can be exceptions. So when I was like pre-thinking how I wanted to do this, one of the ones I found, see this little like water ski practice lake? That's what that is. It's the little turnaround points with the little islands. I did happen to notice this same stretch of highway pretty much due south from there, and you wouldn't even see it here or until you're on kind of short final on the airplane. Okay, let me find it. You see it right here. It's very faint. There are some power lines that do cross the road, and I'm not sure how well the resolution will come out on the video here, but there are some power lines right here. But otherwise, on this stretch of road, I mean, for like miles, it's great unless you happen to be right at an intersection or you do have some occasional other power lines. So if you can get another controller or supervisor or a CIC, and you can at least start to look at some of these and get ahead of the situation, Okay, and remind a pilot, so let's say the pilot has set up and they're coming in from the north. Okay, we got this highway 168. And somewhere out in here, there's a stretch where it looks like they're near a field. They can sidestep to if they need to, and we can maybe get ahead real quickly if they're going to land here in kind of these northeastbound lanes. Scout it out. This isn't going to be perfect, but this isn't bad. If somebody set, oops, there's a set right there that's crossing. And if you kind of think about how I'm doing this pretty live here, okay, this seems pretty wide open, but yes, there are occasional power lines that cross the road. Otherwise, it's pretty clear. And so if the pilot should have an engine failure, okay, as they're coming in, I didn't leave that measurement up, but if they're coming in over here and they say, all right, my engine just went away totally, I'm going to head for the divided highway out here. A, we know where they're going. B, maybe we've pre-scouted it and we have an opportunity, perhaps, because we spent our time wisely back in the 6 minutes when the pilot was back over here, and we can advise the pilot that it looks pretty clear, but be advised, there are some occasional power lines that are almost invisible that do cross the road. Be prepared to sidestep to a field if you need to. Okay, and that might be a way to get ahead of this. So enough of that particular scenario. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit here once more. What if it's IMC? Imagine, because we've been dealing with like VMC situations, but let's imagine for the sake of discussion that it's IMC. All right, same basic setup for discussion purposes. You can game it out in other places and so on around the country. But let's say that, you know, the pilot's up at 9,000 feet and it's IMC, and for discussion purposes, let's say it's overcast, you know, ballpark 800 or 900 feet. You know, the cloud layer's a couple thousand feet thick, so it tops out, you know, at I don't know, 3,500 MSL or something like that, right? Okay, so we're going to start the pilot kind of up here. Where would you bring them if it's IMC in that situation? And for discussion purposes, we'll just talk about what is in fact true. There are approaches into both 1-1 left and 2-9 right at Fresno. Would you vector them on like the 180-ish or maybe even like a 200-ish heading to set them up to do an instrument approach that comes in like this, either an RNAV or this one has like a localizer 1-1? Or would you bring them somewhat farther out, because you can't bring them in super tight, right? And now you got to bring them farther out, you know, so that you can set them up for like the ILS 2-9 right or an RNAV 2-9 right. Now, again, this is one where you'd want to game out. You do want to give it some thought. I am going to recommend, though, that the similar principles apply, but if anything, here the controller or the controlling team actually has a bit more authority, because the pilot probably has no way to know. See, if it's VMC and the pilot is somewhere right about here when the engine fails, okay, they're looking out the window and they're kind of sweating bullets as they're coming in, and at least they kind of know probably there's some bail spots over here. If the engine fails, they can bail over here. If you've got the cloud deck that starts at 3,500 MSL, goes down to, what would it be, 1,100 MSL, they can't really see that. They're probably not going to be familiar with that, and they don't know, and it's a really bad situation. So it's something we'll discuss later in the course, but in these kinds of situations, which are really nasty because there's so much to think about, I argue that the total risk, which is what I'm interested in looking at, and I want to be very careful here, the total risk is probably lower doing something like this conceptually than doing something like this conceptually. Yeah, we're adding ballpark 12 miles to the route of flight, which takes more time, so there is more chance of a total engine failure, but if it were to fail in here, we are adding risk to everybody on board the plane and adding a serious risk to people on the ground that is removed from here, where yes, there is more risk of a total engine failure over time, but in the event of an off-airport landing where they pop out at 800 feet, this has less total risk. So that's a tough one to discuss, and I realize that some are going to just focus on minimizing the time and the distance, which are related, and are going to be very tempted to bring them in. I'm not going to re-diagram it here, but bring them in on a 190 or a 200 and run them in on that approach into 1-1 left and so on. So we're going to wrap up by hopping back in the airplane, and I want to illustrate that. We're going to stay VMC for illustration purposes, and let me just get this set up real quick. I'm going to move the view right one. I'm going to bop up. I'm going to tip the view back down. I'm going to save that as a view. I'm going to flip-flop the comm so that tower's not barking at us. I'm going to leave the flaps 1 notch. I'm going to leave the trim where it's at. I'm going to take the parking brake off with Control numpad delete. And I'm going to do one other thing. We're going to take off on 1 left. I'll leave it VMC, but what we're going to do is set up where we go outbound, and we're going to fly kind of a modified version of the ILS 29er right. So just the reciprocal, direction here on the same piece of pavement. So I want to illustrate something about what happens trying to get ahead and think about what you're going to see later in the course about dealing with engine failure, whether it's partial or total, in IMC conditions. And so let me just set this up real quick. Let me very quickly bring you to the chart for the ILS Yankee 29er right at Fresno. You can ignore the glide slope and use it as a localizer. Okay, and for our purposes, the frequency is 111.3 and the approach course 29er 2. We'll come back to the chart in a minute. But 111.3, and in this airplane, I'm going to zoom in with Control 1 to make it a little easier to see. You just click on the touch screen, and that's something that will bring you to the CDI source, which I want to set for VOR1 instead of the FMS. We'll click back to get out of it. If you click menu, one of the options is the nav1 frequency, and we said 111.3, so 1113. I'm going to transfer to make that active, and when I do, you see that it automatically brought up the course of 112 with the localizer. Now that happens to be because of the way the sim works. It runs both approaches simultaneously, and the localizer 11 left is that same frequency. So after I take off and we get down to this end of the airport, this will actually flip and show the reciprocal inbound course. At the moment, it's showing the course as if we're doing the localizer 11. So let's hit back, and I'm going to do one other thing on that chart before we leave. So assuming we've got somebody who started there kind of up by Friant or sort of just west of Friant, where would you vector them if we decide we're doing the ILS Yankee 2 right in a partial engine failure situation with these kind of IMC conditions that I've talked about? Well, you'd vector them out somewhere a little beyond Story. Story is the final approach fix. Cross it at 1,800 feet. Okay, so I trust that controllers would vector them somewhere a little beyond Story and have them presumably intercept a couple of miles out at ballpark 1,800 feet, because that's what we do, right? We're trying to assist the best we can in this partial engine failure situation in IMC conditions. In this particular scenario, the last thing we want to do is botch it and mess that up, right? I'm going to fly this approach a little differently because I want to make an important point. So let's focus on that crossing altitude of 1,800 feet for a second, okay? The field elevation is 336, and the touchdown zone elevation for 29er right, it's 2 feet different if we sidestep to the other runway, but 333. So what's the AGL altitude for this particular approach at just 4.4 miles from the runway threshold? It's ballpark 1,500 feet. Does everybody see that? So 1,800 MSL minus the field elevation, so ballpark 1,500 MSL. I'm going to hit it at double the AGL altitude, not double the MSL. If I double the MSL, just 1,800 is double to 36. I want to double the AGL altitude. So we're going to cross the final approach fix at twice the normal height relative to the field elevation. I think everybody is on board with what I'm doing here, right? So if we actually did the math, it's not quite exactly 1,500. I'm going to use 1,500. So we're going to cross at 3,300 feet. So I'm going to fly this sort of as almost like a high localizer. We're going to cross Story at 3,300 feet rather than 18. Most controllers in this scenario that I've set up would think, uh-oh, that's a problem. But remember, this is a partial engine failure situation, and I've already said that if it was VMC, we want to leave the airplane high, not clear them down. And this becomes kind of problematic when we're dealing with an instrument approach. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just about done talking, then we're going to fly. So I'm going to cross Story at 3,300 feet with the thing set up as if I'm doing essentially a high localizer. And as I cross Story, I'm going to fail the engine. At that point, and I'm leaving it VMC so you can see it, I'm going to glide as well as I possibly can. I'm going to leave the gear up. I'm going to leave the flaps up, okay? I'm going to slow to the actual best glide speed for this airplane, and we are going to try to glide to the runway from Story at 3,300 feet. I think you're on board with what I'm doing. And I am not going to do anything other than try to glide as well as possible all the way until we either reach or don't reach the runway, because I want to make a point. I'm not going to otherwise try to like land the airplane the right way. So we're all set. Let's roll. I'll bring the volume up. This thing is really touchy on the rudder. Now, to save some time, I'm going to get the gear up. Speed's good for flaps up. And if you look at the localizer signal down here, it's auto-selected in this particular airplane the way it's modeling it. It's showing course 112 because it still thinks we're trying to do the localizer to 11 left, even though the same frequency is the localizer / ILS to 200 right. That should flip momentarily here, and you will see a glide slope. There's the flip, so it's showing the inbound course. In just a moment, you'll see that glide slope window pop up. And then I'm going to sort of accelerate what we're doing here with the sim rate. So I'm going to hit R. I'm going to go Control plus a couple of times. So we're now simming at 4 times the normal rate. And so let me just get this set up. I'm not trying to fly the airplane, in effect, the right way. So, and at 4 times the rate, this kind of vibrates all over the place. So I don't have an independent way to show where story is. If you look at this map here, you'll see there's a couple triangles. And that second one, the one to the southeast, is story. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball it. Work my way out to 3,300 feet, a little past story. I'll bring the sim rate back to 1. Do kind of a quick 180 and then try to get it trimmed out at 3,300 feet. So give me a second here while I do this. Oops, that was a little too much nose down trim. All right, let's go sim rate back to 1. And this is good enough. I'm thinking that if I do a 180 here, I'm going to be pretty much lined up with the localizer. Try to get close to 3,300 feet and get the airplane trimmed out. Now I'm actually going to hit story not only at 3,300 feet. Sorry, I'm doing something else here while I'm letting the nose drop. I'm also going to hit it at about half throttle, so I'll bring the throttle back to about half here. Okay, you can see the runway out there. So I will be aiming for the runway the whole time rather than trying to track the localizer per se. I'm going to zoom in on that map once so you can actually see when we cross story, and just a little low here as I'm trying to do something else. Okay. I have the gear up. You can also see that on that external view if you want. So the gear's up, flaps are up. Just a little bit low here. I'm not trying to be. I'm tracking virtually right down the localizer. Here's 3,300 feet. I'm going to just nose down a little bit. We're coming up on story. And in this particular airplane, there's no mixture control to pull the engine back to idle cutoff. So if anything, I'm just a tad high. I'm just going to turn the ignition key off. All right, I'm going to trim for best glide. So 3,300 feet compared to the 333, we're 3,000 AGL crossing this particular final approach fix. The exact AGL altitude will depend for each approach on how far out from the runway the threshold is. And I'm going to adjust the trim a little bit. I'm trying to trim for right about 60 knots. Which will be about the best glide speed in this airplane. I'm leaving it VMC so that you can see kind of what I'm doing. But we're sort of picturing what would happen if this was IMC. All right. From a flying perspective, at some level, this is actually kind of easy. I just let the trim fly the airplane at right about 60 knots. I'm actually bringing it back just a little bit and trying to not fugoid it or overdo it. Again, we're within just a knot or so, so that's going to be about perfect. So we really are at best glide speed. We got the gear up, the flaps up. The constant speed prop in this airplane, you can adjust it a little bit with the dial here. It's kind of an odd setup, but I'm just going to leave that where it's at. And that's not affecting the point that I'm trying to make here. All right. In the meantime, we've actually got just a little bit of time. For what it's worth, I'm going to hop out of the airplane. And if you ever do try to get ahead of the situation, you're trying to say, you know, hey, there's a divided highway that's probably a better landing spot. We have scouted it for power lines. As you can kind of see here, those highways are generally pretty visible from the air. Sometimes it's a little easier to see the things in the sim than it is in real life. So how's this looking? Place your bets. You have my word. I'm just letting trim handle the pitch and hence the speed. I'm leaving the gear and the flaps up. The only thing I'm doing is making just little tiny corrections with the aileron because the airplane, as you can tell, is kind of wandering around just a little bit. So I'm just trying to keep it pointed at the threshold for 29er right. It's moving around a little bit. It's phugoiding just a tiny bit, but other than just these tiny little aileron corrections so we don't wander off in some other direction, I'm not doing anything with the controls. We started at twice the normal height, and we'll see how we do. Now y'all are very smart. You know that I've done a dress rehearsal on this. For some of these in the videos I have, for some others I haven't. For this particular thing I have, but I know how this is going to end. You place your bets now. At a minimum, I suspect you think that this is going to be kind of close. This is sort of iffy. You're not sure if we're going to make it or not. Okay? But I'd like you to kind of use that to impress upon your mind. How do you think we would have done if we'd crossed Story at the normal altitude of 1,800? Folks, there's no way we would make it. We would have made it roughly halfway to the runway, right? Okay? The reality is that on an instrument approach with a 3-degree glide slope, if you cross the final approach fix at the normal altitude, and obviously each airplane will vary a little bit, but I'm telling you, if you cross the final approach fix at the normal altitude and the engine fails during the approach from that point in, unless it's very, very close in, you're not going to make it to the runway. It takes, and each airplane varies a little bit, and I'm not even going to flare here, I'm just going to let it do what it does. But essentially, twice the normal AGL altitude at the final approach fix, and yes, we landed gear up, is not quite gonna make it. So the takeaway is you actually have to be right about twice the AGL final approach fix altitude to make it the rest of the way in with an engine failure. If anything, you probably need to be a little bit higher. And that leads us to kind of one final takeaway on that. So let's go back to this. I'm going to finish with a quick version of this IFR scenario, which is what we sort of just flew, at least the last portion of it, right? Okay. So let's go back to this situation. Imagine it's the same IFR scenario, so maybe 800 overcast and, 2,000 foot thick cloud layer, something like that. Okay, if it's calm wind, you maybe are sold on the idea that, okay, maybe we go a little farther out and do the approach here because if the engine fails coming in, at least they've got some reasonable chance that improves the survivability for people in the plane and reduces risk to people on the ground. If we'd brought him in the other way, I'm just going to drag this one. But, if the engine had failed, the last 3 or 4 miles coming in from this direction, yuck. And you're injuring people on the ground, right? Plus reducing survivability for people on the plane. But here's another question, and this one's nasty. What if the surface winds were ballpark 0.9 or 0 at 10? And so the winds aloft at 2,000 or 3,000 feet were ballpark, 120 at 30? That's kind of a normal wind thing. How many of you, from an airplane starting here, IFR conditions like I've described, with surface winds 0.90 at 10 and the winds aloft 120 at 30, let's say, would bring them in here and have them fly the approach with a tailwind? I bet a lot of controllers would say, nope, we're supposed to bring them in on a headwind on the approach, and I think a lot of you would default to do this, and you bring them in like this. Here's the thing. Emergencies are different in some cases. And again, there's no easy answer here. It takes some advanced thought to really get your head around this whole thing, but think about it this way. With a headwind, you don't glide as far, okay? And so you're increasing the risk here of landing in that urban area. If you have a tailwind helping you glide, you know, if you can get out to where you're on the final approach, that tailwind actually helps. And so combining a gentle to moderate tailwind, not a big, huge tailwind like 60 knots or something, but a kind of a moderate tailwind on the order of 20 to 30 knots or so on final is beneficial in these cases. And even with the wind at the surface, where I'm describing it as 09 or 0 at 10, folks, this is a 9,500 foot runway. That is absolutely fine for a GA airplane. Normally, we land upwind, but there can be some situations where you land downwind with 10 knots, which is fine, and that is the preferred solution. So I'm going to leave you with this thought. Local safety councils, and just any controller really, wherever you work, say in the country, go to your local area and just think about what that local area is like, okay, and how you would apply it. So you have my word, I've not rehearsed this, but let's just go to, say, Joplin, Missouri, and there's the airport up to the north. Okay, you can kind of see for Joplin that, you know, if the airplane is down here to start, okay, as long as you leave the airplane high, okay, you can probably go basically over downtown Joplin where you've got some built up area for a while, and then it's more reasonable closer in. So every place is going to be different, okay, but just gaming through that, not so that the facility can create a once-for-all answer like what to do in this situation or that situation, because there's an infinite variety, but practice gaming it out on a regular basis. And this includes center controllers. So center controllers that own down to the ground. So the controllers at Minneapolis Center, Salt Lake Center, and other places as well, although I've kind of zoomed in here, you know, you own down to the ground over a wide swath. You're not going to memorize all of these, but for the sake of discussion, and Bismarck, I don't know, maybe he has an approach, but, you know, maybe somebody's heading for an airport kind of in or near Dickinson. I don't see one as I zoom in. Not a totally random thing, but you get the idea. Suppose for the sake of discussion, just for the moment here, that's I-94 or Business 94. You know, suppose for the sake of discussion that you kind of are used to gaming some of these out, and you've practiced some others where, you know, the airport is in some location relative to where the built-up area is, and then you have an emergency into Dickinson, and just for the sake of discussion, as I take one last look for a Dickinson airport, let's just say that the airport is right over here, maybe on the west side of town, kind of an east-west runway next to I-94. You've gotten used to the principles, and you can kind of game them out in real time during a live emergency, and that might inform the way you treat a pilot coming into Dickinson. So I'll leave you with that, so feel free to try these in different situations. Try to game these out in VMC conditions with calm winds, IMC conditions with calm winds, and like I did there in Fresno, where I recommended flying an approach downwind as well as somewhat high when it's IMC. Use the same things I have done. Go to SkyVector, alternate between the low charts, the sectional charts, use the satellite view of Google Maps, and as well, don't be afraid to fly some of this in the sim. I'm not going to describe this slide in detail. So have fun gaming this out, using the flight sim, using the websites, and trying to figure out how you can deal with this nasty beast of a tricky situation of partial engine failures. Thank you.